There is a moment that historians have argued about for decades. A single point in time when the most powerful military dictatorship in modern history began to die, not on a battlefield, not in a burning city, not in a courtroom or a negotiating room, but in a dimly lit briefing room. In the early hours of June morning in 1944, when a man who had spent years convinced of his own invincibility finally heard words he had refused to believe were possible. The Atlantic Wall had been breached, the Allies were ashore in Normandy, and the man who had staked everything, the lives of millions, the future of a continent, the ideological project that had consumed 2 decades of his existence, on the certainty that they could never get there, stood before his generals looking not like a warlord, but like someone who had just been told the walls of his own house were on fire. What you are about to hear is not a simple story about a military operation, although it is certainly that. It is a story about what happens inside a command structure when reality and belief diverge so catastrophically that the men responsible for making decisions can no longer tell one from the other. It is a story about how the most elaborate coastal defense system in the history of warfare was built on a psychological foundation so fragile that a single day, a single morning, really, was enough to crack it open. And it is a story about a man who built his entire identity around certainty, and about what that certainty cost him when it met something stronger than itself. If you ever wonder what the collapse of a regime looks like from the inside, not the rubble, not the surrenders, not the trials and the newsreel footage, but the actual psychological moment when the man at the top realized that the game is over, then you need to hear this story. Because the fall of the Atlantic Wall wasn't just a military defeat. It was the moment Hitler's entire framework of reality cracked open and something cold and final began to seep through. And almost nobody in that room was willing to say it out loud. Before we go any further, I want to ask you to hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications. We release documentaries like this one every single week, going deeper into the hidden history of the Second World War, the decisions behind the decisions, the moments when individual psychology changed the course of entire campaigns. I don't want you to miss a single one. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Because to understand what happened on the morning of June 6, 1944, you have to understand what the Atlantic Wall actually was, and more importantly, what Adolf Hitler believed it was. By the spring of 1944, the Atlantic Wall existed in 2 very different versions, and the gap between those 2 versions was itself one of the most consequential facts of the entire war. There was a version that appeared in German propaganda newsreels, an impregnable fortress stretching for 1,000 miles from the Arctic coast of Norway all the way to the Spanish border, a continuous line of reinforced concrete bunkers, steel obstacles, artillery emplacements, radar installations, and minefields so dense and so sophisticated that no amphibious force in the history of warfare could survive contact with it. German newspapers ran photographs of massive coastal guns capable of destroying ships miles offshore. Wehrmacht engineers were filmed with obvious pride laying thousands of beach obstacles, iron hedgehogs, Belgian gates, wooden stakes tipped with mines, angled steel rails designed to rip the bottoms out of landing craft before they ever delivered their soldiers to dry ground. Radio broadcasts described the wall in language that mixed technical pride with almost mystical certainty. Europe had been made impenetrable, the continent was sealed, and any invader who dared to test that seal would pay for his presumption in blood. Goebbels' propaganda machine had spent 2 years convincing the German public, and to a very considerable extent the German high command itself, that the western coastline of Europe was simply not penetrable by any force the Allies could assemble. It was a wall in the most literal and absolute sense, a hard, permanent, impassable boundary between the Reich and whatever the Western Allies might attempt. Then there was the real Atlantic Wall. And the real Atlantic Wall was something else entirely. The concrete and steel were real enough in certain sectors. Nobody who has ever walked the cliffs above the Pas-de-Calais and looked at the gun emplacements there, the massive reinforced structures that still stand today, their concrete walls thick enough to survive almost anything that 1944 technology could deliver, can doubt that the German engineering effort in some parts of French coastline was genuinely formidable. The Pas-de-Calais sector, which commanded the narrowest crossing point of the English Channel, received a lion's share of German resources, labor, cement, and military attention throughout the entire construction program. Hitler himself had long been convinced that if the Allies attempted a cross-channel invasion, they would logically choose the shortest route, 45 miles of open water against the nearly 100 miles that separated the Normandy coast from the English ports. And this conviction, which was shared by most of his senior commanders and was, on purely geometric grounds, entirely reasonable, meant that the Pas-de-Calais received what Normandy did not: the heavy coastal guns that could reach across to the English coast on a clear day. The bunkers were thick enough to survive direct artillery hits from naval guns. The minefields and the approaches were genuinely dense. If the Allies had come ashore at the Pas-de-Calais, they would have faced something that, while not the invincible structure of Goebbels' newsreels, at least approximated the formidable obstacle that the propaganda described. But Normandy was different, and the difference was not marginal. It was the difference between a prepared defense and a pretense. By June 1944, the Normandy coastline was defended by formations that were, in the polite and careful language of Wehrmacht operational reports, of limited offensive capability. What that phrase actually meant, translated from the bureaucratic German of the high command into the plain language of what was actually on those beaches, was this: many of the men holding the Normandy coastline were not the young, well-trained, ideologically motivated German soldiers of the early war years. They were older men carrying injuries that had never fully healed from wounds received on the Eastern Front, men transferred from garrison duties in occupied territories where the primary requirement had been presence rather than combat effectiveness. They were Poles and Czechs and Alsatians and men from a dozen other nations of occupied Europe, conscripted into the Wehrmacht not because they wanted to fight for the Reich, but because the Reich had run out of Germans who could fight. The 716th Infantry Division, which held a sector that would become Omaha and Gold Beaches on June 6, was classified in the Wehrmacht's organizational charts as a static division, a designation that meant exactly what it sounded like. It had almost no motorized transport, which meant it couldn't move. It had limited artillery support compared to frontline divisions. It was expected to fight from fixed positions because the organizational structure of the Wehrmacht in 1944 simply did not allow for anything else. These were not Rommel's Afrika Korps veterans. These were not the Panzer Grenadiers who had smashed through Poland and France. These were men assigned to a coastline that the German High Command believed the Allies would probably not choose, holding positions that had been built with whatever concrete and steel was left over after the fortifications at the Pas-de-Calais had been supplied. It is worth pausing for a moment on what this means, because the implications run very deep. If you had stood on the cliffs above Normandy in the spring of 1944 and looked at the German defenses from the outside, from the perspective of an Allied intelligence officer trying to assess whether they could be overcome, what you would have seen would have been genuinely alarming. The bunkers were real. The obstacles on the beaches were real. The machine guns and the casemates were real, and the men behind them, whatever their origins, were capable of pulling triggers. The defensive positions on the bluffs above Omaha Beach, in particular, were designed with considerable tactical skill, positioned to cover every approach to the sand with overlapping fields of fire that left almost no dead ground. Anyone who tells you that the Normandy defenses were negligible has not looked at the casualty figures for June 6. They were not negligible. They were lethal, but they were not the Atlantic Wall of German propaganda. They were a fraction of that wall, the part that had been built with what was left over, manned by who was left over, and held together by the assumption that the main blow would fall somewhere else. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had seen this problem clearly from the moment he arrived to inspect the coastal defenses in late 1943, when the Desert Fox, the most famous German general of the war, the commander who had driven the British 8th Army back and forth across North Africa for 2 years and had made his name synonymous with operational brilliance, was given command of Army Group B and tasked with strengthening the Atlantic Wall. His first response was not satisfaction, but something closer to alarm. He traveled the entire length of the French coastline, from the mouth of the Scheldt in the north to the Bay of Biscay in the south, and what he saw left him with a verdict that he expressed privately in terms that were blunt to the point of what, in a less forgiving environment, would have been career-ending insubordination. The wall, he told his staff, was a propaganda lie. It was a line drawn on a map to comfort people who did not want to think too carefully about what was actually standing between the Reich and an Allied landing. Some sectors had real substance. Most did not. And the gap between what was on the propaganda newsreels and what was actually on the ground could not be closed by optimism or by will. Rommel set about trying to fix the problem with the same driven intensity that had made him famous in North Africa. He ordered massive programs of obstacle laying on the beaches, hundreds of thousands of mines planted in the surf zone, and on the approaches, millions of beach obstacles manufactured and deployed, artillery positions strengthened, communication trenches improved. He traveled constantly, appearing without warning at divisional and regimental headquarters, demanding to know the exact state of defenses, personally surveying firing positions and access routes and supply arrangements. His energy was infectious and his standards were uncompromising, and by the spring of 1944, he had genuinely improved the defensive posture along large stretches of French coastline. The beaches that would be assaulted on June 6th were more heavily defended than they had been 6 months earlier. Rommel's program had made a real difference. But Rommel also had a specific vision for how the invasion should be fought, a vision that brought him into direct, irreconcilable conflict with his superiors, and most critically, with Hitler himself. Rommel believed, based on his experience fighting the Allies in North Africa and his careful analysis of Allied air power capabilities, that the critical window was the first 24 hours of any invasion. If the Allies could be stopped on the beaches, if the panzer reserves could be moved to the coast quickly enough to hit the invasion force while it was most vulnerable, while it was still in the water or just coming ashore, before it had organized itself and consolidated its foothold, there was a chance, a genuine chance, not a certainty, but a real military possibility. The Allies at that moment would be at their most disorganized, their command structure not yet fully established ashore, their logistics not yet functioning, their soldiers separated from their equipment, and their officers arriving on beaches that were also coming under artillery and small arms fire. But if the Allies were allowed to get ashore, to build up their strength over the first critical hours, to bring their overwhelming air power and naval gunfire to bear on German counterattack columns, then no amount of tactical brilliance would save the situation. The gap in material power between the Allies and Germany was simply too great. Once the Allies had a functioning beachhead with 1,000 or more ships offshore delivering men and equipment around the clock, the outcome would be decided by arithmetic rather than strategy. And the arithmetic, Rommel knew, went only one way. This analysis brought Rommel into direct collision with the commander of Panzer Group West, General Leo Gere von Schweppenberg, and with the instincts of Hitler himself. Gere was a formal thinker who believed in classical armor doctrine: hold the mobile reserves well back on the coast, beyond a range of Allied naval gunfire, wait until the main axis of the Allied attack was clearly established, and then deliver a concentrated armor blow that would crush the invasion force before it could achieve the tactical depth needed to break out into the French interior. It was a reasonable theory in the abstract. It was the kind of thinking that had been validated in the early war years, when German armor doctrine had proven itself superior to almost anything the Allies could bring against it. In a different set of circumstances, with a different opponent, in a different theater, in a different year, it might have been the right answer. But Rommel pointed out with increasing frustration that the theory contained a fatal assumption, that the panzer columns could actually move to the front in good order once the invasion began. And that assumption ignored the one factor that had transformed the nature of warfare in Western Europe since 1942: Allied air power. By the spring of 1944, Allied fighter-bombers had turned the roads and railways of northern France into a deadly environment for any German military column. The systematic campaign of interdiction that had been building since 1943 had demolished bridges, cratered marshalling yards, destroyed fuel depots, and made the daylight movement of any large German military formation essentially suicidal. Allied pilots had developed a particular expertise in what they called armed reconnaissance, roaming over the transport network looking for targets, attacking anything that moved in daylight with machine guns, rockets, and bombs. A single fighter-bomber squadron could paralyze an entire armored division for hours. And on D-Day, Rommel argued, the entire weight of Allied tactical air power would be directed precisely at preventing German reinforcements from reaching the coast. The panzer reserves would be destroyed on the roads, not on the battlefield. Hitler's solution to this conflict between his two most important Western commanders was characteristically his own, and it bore all the marks of his particular style of command. He would keep the final decision about releasing the strategic armor reserves in his own hands. The three divisions of the OKW Reserve, the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, the Panzerlehr Division, and the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division Gotz von Berlichingen, would not be released to Army Group B without his direct personal authorization. No field commander, not Rommel, not von Rundstedt, not anyone below the Führer himself, could order them to move. Only Hitler could give that order. The logic behind his decision, from Hitler's perspective, was straightforward. Preserve the crucial armor reserve until the main axis of Allied advance was confirmed, prevent Rommel from wasting the panzers against a diversionary attack, and then deliver the decisive blow at the right moment and the right place. It was the kind of thinking that had served Hitler well in the early years of the war, when his instincts had repeatedly overruled his general's caution and been vindicated by events. The problem in 1944 was that the decision-making structure it created required Hitler to be awake, aware, and capable of acting quickly when the invasion began. And on the night of June 5th, in the early morning hours of June 6, 1944, Adolf Hitler was asleep at the Berghof, his mountain retreat high above the town of Berchtesgaden in Bavaria, and the men who might have woken him were afraid to do so. The fear was not irrational. Hitler's inner circle had learned through years of painful experience that waking the Führer to deliver uncertain news that might prove false, news that might be interpreted as evidence of weakness or panic on the part of whoever brought it, was an act that carried significant personal risk. The previous months had produced multiple invasion alerts that had proven to be false alarms, and each false alarm had left its mark on the officers responsible for raising it. Moreover, in the particular culture of the Berghof, where Hitler's personal habits and preferences set the rhythm of the entire establishment, there was a deeper dynamic at work. The people around him had spent years learning to read his moods and adjust their behavior accordingly, and the prospect of being the person who woke the Führer to announce that something had gone wrong with his carefully constructed defensive system was not an attractive one. So they waited, they gathered the information, they assessed, they consulted with each other in the corridors and the anteroom, and they let him sleep. The first reports of Allied airborne landings behind the Normandy coast had begun reaching German military headquarters shortly after 1:30 in the morning on June 6. American paratroopers of the 82nd Airborne Division and the 101st Airborne Division had begun dropping into the Cotentin Peninsula and the fields behind Utah Beach in the dark, their transport aircraft threading through anti-aircraft fire, the paratroopers scattered by navigation errors and strong winds across a much wider area than the drop plans had intended. British paratroopers of the 6th Airborne Division had landed east of the Orne River with more precision, seizing the bridges at Benouville, what would later become famous as Pegasus Bridge, in a coup de main operation executed with the kind of controlled violence that spoke to months of intensive specialized training. German sentries along the coast reported parachutes falling in the dark. German radar stations tracked the formations of Allied aircraft crossing the channel. By 3 a.m., the reports were multiplying fast enough that the headquarters of the 7th Army, which had responsibility for the Normandy sector, was fully awake and trying to understand what it was dealing with. But understanding was exactly what remained elusive, because the most successful element of the Allied D-Day plan was not any of the things that would later be celebrated in histories and films and commemoration ceremonies. The most successful element was a deception, the vast, intricate, brilliantly sustained campaign of lies and misdirection that had been running for months, and that had done more to shape German perceptions of the invasion's likely form than any other single factor. Operation Fortitude was arguably the most successful strategic deception in the history of warfare. Its central element was the creation of the first United States Army Group, known as FUSAG, a fictional formation supposedly assembled in southeast England, poised across the channel to the Pas-de-Calais at the moment the real Allied forces would be landing in Normandy. FUSAG existed only on paper and in the radio traffic that Allied signals teams were generating around the clock, carefully crafting messages at the right level of classification, with the right vocabulary at the right frequency, to convince German listening posts that they were eavesdropping on the communications of a genuine and enormous military organization. And to command this fictional army, the Allies had chosen with brilliant insight the one man whose name, in the mind of any German intelligence officer, would be automatically associated with the most ambitious and aggressive Allied offensive operation imaginable, General George S. Patton. Patton's reputation in Germany was, by 1944, extraordinary. He was seen by the Wehrmacht as the Allies' best operational commander, the man most likely to be given the most important assignment, the man who would lead whatever attack was designed to be decisive. The Germans had studied him carefully after North Africa and Sicily. Their intelligence assessments rated him very highly, and when Allied deception planners placed him in nominal command of Fusag, they were exploiting this reputation with devastating effectiveness. German intelligence reports as late as May 1944 identified Fusag as a primary formation and Normandy as a possible secondary operation designed to draw German reserves away from the Pas-de-Calais before Patton's army crossed the narrowest point of the channel to deliver the real blow. This pre-existing framework of deception shaped how every piece of information that came into German headquarters on the night of June 5th was processed. When the first report of airborne landings arrived, the immediate instinct of most German commanders at every level was to ask, is this the feint? Is this the secondary operation that we were told would precede the main crossing? The very fact that the landings were in Normandy, not at the Pas-de-Calais, not where the defenses were strongest, not where the shortest crossing led, was, paradoxically, evidence to some German officers that this was not the real invasion. Why would the Allies choose the harder route unless they wanted to draw German attention and reserves away from an easier one? The logic of the deception had been internalized so thoroughly that reality itself was being filtered through it. At the Berghof, Hitler's adjutants knew their Führer had retired late after an evening that had stretched well past midnight. He had been expansive and relaxed in the company of his guests, speaking at length about the military situation, about the expected Allied invasion, about the certainty that the Atlantic Wall would prove itself when the test came. He had been in one of his more optimistic moods, the kind of mood that followed a stretch of days when the news from all fronts had been managed carefully enough to present a picture that could be interpreted as something short of catastrophic. He had finally gone to bed sometime after 3 a.m. By the time the airborne landing reports were coming in from Normandy, it was approaching 4 a.m. The choice of whether to wake him was made, essentially, by not making it. The sea assault began at 6:30 in the morning of June 6, 1944. 5 beaches, codenamed Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword, stretched across roughly 50 miles of the Normandy coast between the Cotentin Peninsula and the estuary of the Orne River. On 4 of those 5 beaches, the landings went as well as could have been reasonably hoped. Costly in human terms, always costly, because amphibious assault against a prepared defense is among the most dangerous military operations a soldier can be asked to execute, but tactically successful in that the Allied forces got ashore, established their footholds, and began the grinding, bloody work of moving inland. Utah Beach, where the American 4th Infantry Division came ashore supported by the Rangers and some of the 101st Airborne troopers who had landed nearby, saw a relatively light resistance and casualties that were, in the terrible arithmetic of amphibious assault, far below what the planners had feared. On Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches, the British and Canadian forces fought hard against determined German defenders, but made steady progress. Pushing off the beaches and into the Norman village of Courcelles, the town of Bayeux's outskirts, the outskirts of Ouistreham. It was costly, it was ugly, but it was working. Omaha was different. Omaha was a catastrophe that became, through the obstinate courage of the men who survived its first hours, a victory that nothing in the morning's experience had made seem likely. Omaha Beach, where the American 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, the most experienced American division in the European theater, and the 29th Infantry Division were landing between the villages of Vierville-sur-Mer and Colleville-sur-Mer, had become a slaughter ground by mid-morning, a confluence of factors, each individually damaging and collectively devastating, had turned the beach into something that survivors would spend the rest of their lives trying to find adequate words for. The 352nd Infantry Division, a German formation of considerably higher quality than the static divisions holding the flanking beaches, had moved into the Omaha sector weeks earlier, and its presence had not been detected by Allied intelligence. The amphibious Sherman tanks that were supposed to precede the infantry onto the beach, floating on canvas screens, providing armor support in the critical first minutes, had been launched in sea conditions that swamped most of them within sight of the shore. Navigational errors pushed landing craft laterally along the beach, depositing soldiers not in the sectors where they had rehearsed, but in the sectors with the heaviest German defenses. The aerial bombardment that was supposed to crater the beach and provide cover for the assault troops had dropped its bombs miles inland to avoid hitting the landing craft, leaving the German positions essentially intact. And the beach configuration itself, a long, relatively flat stretch of sand backed by a low seawall, and then steep bluffs, with the German defensive positions on the bluffs perfectly positioned to bring enfilading fire across the entire approach, gave the defenders advantages that no amount of planning could fully compensate for. Men were drowning in the surf under the weight of their equipment before they ever reached the sand. The ones who made it through the water found themselves exposed on an open beach with nowhere to go, no cover, no supporting armor, the seawall 50 or 100 yards away, and every foot of those yards swept by machine gun fire, mortar rounds falling among the groups of men who had taken shelter behind the beach obstacles. The officers who had trained these men for months were dying in the first minutes, leaving sergeants and corporals and privates to make decisions that no one had imagined would fall to them. By late morning, the senior American commander offshore, General Omar Bradley, was receiving reports from the beach that described a situation that the phrase tactical reversal could not adequately capture. He was considering whether to suspend the Omaha landings entirely and redirect the follow-on forces to the beaches where things were going better. And yet the men on Omaha Beach were still alive. They were still, somehow, moving. Small groups of soldiers, their officers often dead, and their formations completely disorganized, had found gaps in the German wire, had found the dead ground in the folds of the bluffs that the German bunkers could not cover, had found the one quality that the German defensive calculations, however sophisticated, had failed to adequately account for. Human beings who refused to accept the arithmetic that said they should be dead. Sergeant after sergeant, lieutenant after lieutenant, ordinary men whose names history mostly does not remember, stood up on that beach and told the men around them to follow, and some of those men followed, and they climbed the bluffs through the German fire and began the work of rolling up the positions that had been killing their comrades from above. By mid-afternoon, Omaha was still a scene of extraordinary violence and suffering, but was no longer in danger of collapse. The beachhead was holding. Hitler finally woke sometime around 10 a.m. The first substantive military conference of the day, the one at which the news from Normandy would be formally presented to the Führer, was convened around noon. By that time, Allied forces had been ashore on Normandy beaches for nearly 6 hours. The largest amphibious operation in the history of warfare had been underway for half a day, and the man who had constructed the entire German strategic posture in the west around his personal control of the armored reserve, the man whose explicit decision to withhold those reserves from any subordinate authority had left Rommel unable to execute the only strategy that might have worked, was having his breakfast. The account of the noon conference at the Berghof on June 6, 1944, are drawn from the recollections of men who were present, adjutants, senior staff officers, aides who were close enough to observe, but far enough from the center of power to be honest in their later accounts. They are consistent enough in their broad outlines to form a historically reliable picture, and what they describe is not a man who immediately understood that the catastrophe he had been told was impossible had happened. What they describe is something harder to watch, and in some ways more illuminating. A man who had already decided what the invasion meant before he heard a single word of the briefing. Hitler's initial response to the news of the Normandy landings was satisfaction. Not alarm, not urgent calculation. Satisfaction. This sounds paradoxical, but the accounts from multiple independent sources are entirely consistent on this point. Hitler had been waiting for the invasion. He had been telling his commanders for more than a year that the Allied invasion would be the decisive moment of the war, the moment when the Western Allies committed their forces to a fixed point on the European coastline where German arms could finally destroy them and settle the question of the Western theater for good. He had constructed an elaborate and deeply held vision of what would happen when that moment came. The Allies would attempt a landing somewhere along the European coast. The Atlantic Wall would inflict catastrophic casualties on the assault forces. The survivors would retreat in disorder to their ships. The invasion would fail, and the political will of Britain and America to continue fighting would collapse under the weight of that failure. Britain would negotiate. America would look for a way to disengage. Germany could then turn its full military weight to the east and end the war on terms that preserved the essential achievements of the previous 4 years. This vision was not a recent comfort. It was a framework that Hitler had been constructing and elaborating and reinforcing for years, a structure of conviction so fundamental to his understanding of the war's trajectory that his entire strategic posture in the West had been organized around it. The Atlantic Wall was its physical expression. The organizational decision to keep the armored reserve under his personal control was its operational expression. And on the morning of June 6th, when the first reports of the Normandy landings reached the Berghof, Hitler's initial response fit this framework, as if the framework had been designed to receive exactly this information. The Allies had overreached. They had committed themselves. The wall would destroy them. This was the moment he had been waiting for. When aides brought him reports that included the serious situation at Omaha Beach, where the Germans were inflicting the kind of catastrophic casualties on the assault forces that the framework predicted, his response was reportedly one of vindication. Things were going according to expectations. The wall was holding. The Allies were suffering. The framework was being confirmed. It was not confirmed. But in those first hours, the information was ambiguous enough, and the framework was strong enough that the ambiguity could be resolved in only one direction. The military conference that convened around noon had an atmosphere that those present would later describe as oddly relaxed, even cheerful on Hitler's part. He is reported to have referred more than once to the fact that he had anticipated this, that the enemy had chosen to test a wall and was discovering what that test cost. When the request from Army Group B for authorization to release the OKW Panzer Reserve was presented, Hitler's response was to defer it. The situation was not yet clear enough. The full picture had not yet emerged. Normandy might still be a diversion. The main blow might still be coming at the Pas-de-Calais. General Jodl, the OKW operations chief, shared this assessment and expressed it with the careful, measured tone that characterized his relationship with Hitler, never directly opposing, always framing his concerns as questions of operational prudence rather than strategic doubt. And in that deferral, in that atmosphere of misplaced calm at the Berghof, while men were dying on the beaches and in the surf and on the bluffs of Normandy, the window that Rommel had identified as the only window that mattered began to close. Because every hour that passed without the Panzer reserves moving to the coast was an hour in which Allied engineers were bulldozing exits off the beaches, in which Allied soldiers were pushing into the first Norman villages, in which the destroyers offshore were systematically engaging the German defensive positions with gunfire that the coastal bunkers had never been designed to withstand at such close range. The Allied beachhead was becoming, with every passing hour, more solid, more defensible, more capable of absorbing the kind of armored counterattack that the OKW Reserve had been held in place to deliver. The mathematics of amphibious consolidation were working relentlessly in the Allies' favor. Time was the one resource that the Germans could not replace. And at the Berghof, the man who controlled the instrument that might have bought time was telling his generals that the situation was developing as planned. When the orders for the Panzer Reserve finally came, and they came partially, confusedly, in the early afternoon of June 6, the tactical situation had already shifted enough to transform the character of what those orders could accomplish. The 12th SS Panzer Division and Panzerlehr received their movement orders, but as their columns began to roll toward the Normandy coast, the Allied air umbrella was fully deployed and waiting for them. The fighter bombers of the 2nd Tactical Air Force and the 9th United States Air Force had been hunting German transport columns since dawn, and now they descended on the Panzer columns, moving up from their assembly areas with a systematic ferocity that exceeded even Rommel's predictions. Roads were blocked by burning vehicles. Fuel trucks exploded in columns of black smoke that could be seen from miles away. Tank transporters were caught in defile and destroyed. Column commanders ordered their vehicles off the roads and into the tree lines, waiting for darkness, moving in short bursts when the aircraft seemed to pass, stopping again when the sound of engines returned from the west. Panzerlehr, one of the most powerful armored divisions the Wehrmacht had ever assembled, a division built from demonstration and training units, staffed with experienced instructors who knew their equipment and their tactics as well as any soldiers in the German army, took catastrophic losses just moving from its assembly area to the front. Its commander, General Fritz Bayerlein, would later estimate that his division arrived in Normandy with a fraction of the strength it had left with. By the time the first Panzer units reached the Norman bocage, June 6th was over. The Allied beachhead was no longer the vulnerable, disorganized foothold of the first hours. It was beginning to harden. The moment when Hitler truly confronted the reality of what had happened is harder to locate than the dramatic clarity of a single scene suggests. History very rarely delivers such clean moments of recognition, and the mechanisms by which human beings process information that fundamentally challenges their existing frameworks are rarely sudden or complete. What the conference transcripts, the general's memoirs, and the operational records of the weeks following D-Day describe is a progression, gradual, reluctant, and marked by particular anguish of a man whose entire identity had been built around the certainty that he was right and whose framework was, for the first time, encountering reality it could not contain. The first crack came in the late afternoon of June 6 with the news from Omaha. The situation there had reversed. American soldiers had climbed the bluffs. The German positions that had been slaughtering the assault troops from above had been silenced one by men who had found their way around and above them. The beach was still terrible. The bodies in the surf, the wrecked vehicles, the burning landing craft, but the men were moving inland. When this news reached Hitler, there was, by the account of those present, a first moment of recalibration. Not an admission that the framework was wrong, not a strategic reassessment, but a slight adjustment, a shifting of weight. That was itself an acknowledgement that something had not gone as the framework predicted. But even then, the dominant interpretation was the one that fit the existing structure. Normandy was probably still a diversion. The main blow was still probably coming at the Pas-de-Calais. Don't commit everything. Wait, the panzer reserves that have been released should be used cautiously, not thrown against a beachhead in a single decisive blow that might leave nothing if the real attack followed. This waiting, this strategic hesitation that was rooted not in military calculation, but in psychological necessity, became the central feature of German decision-making in the days and weeks after June 6. Hitler would spend the next several weeks insisting, in the face of accumulating evidence, that the Pas-de-Calais landing was still coming, that Fusag was still preparing to move, that Patton was still waiting for his moment. His generals, particularly Rommel and von Rundstedt, who had command of Army Group B and OB West respectively, would spend those same weeks trying to extract enough of the available forces to deal with the very real, very present, and very threatening Allied presence in Normandy, while the strategic logic of their Führer kept one hand on their shoulder, pulling them back. The deception operation continued to work with thoroughness that its architects had not fully dared to hope for. It worked not just on D-Day itself, but for weeks afterward, holding German panzer divisions in the Pas-de-Calais area, while the Normandy beachhead grew and consolidated, and the Allies brought in the men and equipment and supplies that would eventually fuel the breakout. The 15th Army, which held the Pas-de-Calais sector with some of the best divisions in the German order of battle, sat and waited for a landing that would never come. While in Normandy, the forces available to stop the real invasion bled themselves dry in the hedgerows. The ghost army that had never existed continued to shape German strategic decisions long after the real invasion had established itself permanently on French soil. Rommel's personal reckoning with what was happening in Normandy was, by the accounts of those who worked with him most closely, one of the most psychologically intense experiences of his career. He had staked his professional reputation on the argument that the invasion must be stopped at the waterline. He had fought for the resources, the positioning, the command arrangements that would have given that strategy a chance. He had been overruled at the crucial moment, not by military argument, but by Hitler's personal authority over the Panzer Reserve. And now, watching the Allied beachhead consolidate from his headquarters, he was witnessing in real time the consequences of what he had predicted. The bitterness in his private correspondence from this period is palpable, and so is something else. A clarity of strategic vision that is rare in any military commander, and rarer still in one who has just watched his predictions proven correct and his strategy rejected. By late June, Rommel was writing to Hitler directly, with a frankness that is personal standing. His status as the most celebrated German soldier alive, the man who had been plastered on propaganda posters and used by Goebbels as the living embodiment of Wehrmacht effectiveness, gave him a freedom of expression that his colleagues could not safely employ. He told Hitler that the situation in Normandy was deteriorating beyond the capacity of the available German forces to reverse. He told him that Allied air power had made large-scale armored counterattack impossible in daylight. He told him that the men of Army Group B were fighting with courage and determination, but that courage and determination could not compensate for material inferiority that the Allies were bringing to bear in the Norman hedgerows. And then he wrote the sentence that must have landed at the Berghof like a physical blow. The troops see no prospect of bringing the enemy's offensive to a halt, and the political consequences of the situation must be drawn. This sentence, in the measured language of military correspondence, said what Rommel was actually saying. The wall has fallen, the war in the West is lost, and you need to find a political way out before the military situation makes even a bad peace impossible. It was the most direct challenge to Hitler's framework of any communication he received from a senior military commander in this period, and it came from a man whose loyalty to the German military cause was beyond question, and whose assessment of military reality had been proven, over the previous 4 years, to be reliable. Hitler's response was not on record in any direct written form, but his subsequent behavior makes the response entirely clear. He rejected the assessment. He rejected the conclusion. He continued to insist that a counterattack could be organized, that the right combination of forces in the right moment had not yet been found but would be found, that the strategic situation was not as dark as Rommel described. The framework held, or appeared to hold, or was maintained by the force of will that had always been Hitler's most fundamental resource. What is perhaps most revealing about the German command experience in the weeks after D-Day is not the military story, although the military story is striking enough. It is the psychological story, the story of what it costs an organization at every level to function in a reality that its leadership officially refuses to acknowledge. The daily briefings of the various headquarters, at OKW in Rassenberg, at OB West in La Roche-Guyon, at Army Group B in the Loire Valley, were exercises in a kind of collective performance. The generals who attended them knew, with varying degrees of clarity and at varying times, what the fall of the Atlantic Wall actually meant. They knew that the Allied beachhead could not be destroyed by any forces available to them. They knew that the strategic reserve had been committed too late, and against conditions that made its effectiveness a fraction of what it would have been on June 6. They knew that the Bocage fighting, for all its tactical intensity and tactical cost of the Allies, was not going to change the strategic equation. And they knew that the man who controlled German strategy could not be told these things in any form that would be heard. What emerged from this situation was a command culture that had been developing since the early years of the war, but that reached its fullest and most destructive expression in the summer of 1944. A culture which the information provided to Hitler was systematically, carefully, and individually adjusted at each level of its transmission to produce a picture that was as accurate as possible in its tactical details and as misleading as possible in its strategic implications. Each officer who passed a report upward exercised a private judgment about what could be said and what could not, what phrasing would be received, and what would provoke a reaction that destroyed the career of whoever had used it. The result, by June and July of 1944, was a Hitler who was receiving daily briefings in which the tactical details of the Norman Bocage fighting were described with considerable accuracy, and the strategic meaning of those details was essentially absent. The attempt on Hitler's life on July 20th, 1944, 44 days after D-Day, was rooted in a recognition that had been building among certain officers of the German High Command since well before the Normandy landings, but that the events of June had brought to a specific operational conclusion. The men who placed the bomb in the conference room at Rassenberg were not acting from abstract principle alone, although principles were certainly involved. They were acting in the context of a military reality that the ablest of them had been watching develop with increasing horror, a reality in which the fall of the Atlantic Wall had closed the last viable path to anything that could be called a German victory, in which the leadership that had brought Germany to that point was psychologically incapable of the honest assessment that might have permitted some form of political solution, and in which every day that passed without that assessment was a day that cost Germany, cost ordinary German soldiers and ordinary German civilians lives and suffering that served no strategic purpose. The bomb failed to kill Hitler. It killed 4 other men, wounded others, and left the Fuhrer with ruptured eardrums, a burned uniform, and a shaken but intact conviction that Providence had once again confirmed his special role. His response to his survival was characteristically his own. He interpreted it not as luck, not as the accident of a heavy conference table that had absorbed much of the blast, but as a sign, a confirmation. The path was right. The setbacks in Normandy and in the East were tests that the right leadership, his leadership, would overcome. The same mechanism that had absorbed the shock of June 6th and processed it as confirmation now absorbed the shock of July 20th and produced from it a hardened certainty that the doubters were wrong, that the conspirators were traitors, that the framework remained sound. This certainty would produce, in the autumn of 1944, the plan for the Ardennes offensive. The audacity of the conception, breaking through the weakly defended Ardennes sector of the Allied line, driving to the Meuse, then swinging north to Antwerp to cut off the entire Allied Northern Army group and force the kind of strategic crisis that might break the Western coalition, was genuine. It reflected the same operational imagination that had produced the original Ardennes breakthrough in May 1940. But 1940 and 1944 were not the same war, and the German army of 1944 was not the German army of 1940. The men were the same, in the sense that the Wehrmacht soldiers still fought with professional skill and a physical courage that no one who has studied the Bocage fighting or the defense of the Rhine could reasonably deny. The tactics were the same. The organizational expertise was the same, but the material foundation was gone. The fuel was insufficient for the operational distances the plan required. The air cover that had protected German armored columns in 1940 did not exist in 1944. The Allied armies that had stumbled in France in May and June of 1940 had, in the intervening 4 years, learned an enormous amount about how to fight the Wehrmacht, and they were not going to stumble in the same way again. The Ardennes offensive achieved tactical surprise. It achieved significant initial penetration of the Allied line. It inflicted real casualties and caused real disruption to the Allied command structure in its opening days. And it consumed the last mobile reserves that the German army possessed in the West, committing them against conditions, an attack that ran out of fuel, then found itself surrounded on 3 sides and bombed from above when the weather cleared, that ensured the losses could not be replaced. The last German strategic counteroffensive in the West ended not with a breakthrough to Antwerp, but with the destruction of the forces it had been launched with. After the Ardennes, the arithmetic became impossible to disguise. The Rhine was crossed by Allied forces in March 1945. German cities were being systematically destroyed from the air. The Soviet forces that had been building for months behind the Vistula line broke through in January and drove westward with speed and momentum that made the Bocage fighting look like a slow-motion engagement. By April 1945, the geography of the German situation had been reduced to a strip of territory squeezed between advancing armies on every side, and Adolf Hitler was in a Führer bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery in Berlin, moving non-existent divisions on maps that represented a reality he could no longer see. The fall of the Atlantic Wall was the beginning of all of this, not the cause of German defeat in any simple, direct sense. The causes of German defeat are multiple and deep and have been accumulating for years before June 1944. But the fall of the wall was a moment when those accumulated causes finally produced a result that was irreversible. Before June 6, 1944, there were still, in theory, strategic paths by which Germany might have achieved something less than total defeat. The possibilities were narrow and required either a fundamental change in German political leadership or a catastrophic fracture in the Allied coalition, neither of which was particularly likely, but they were not strictly zero. After June 6, 1944, after the Normandy beachhead had consolidated and the strategic reserve had been committed too late, and the Bocage had ground down the German mobile forces faster than they could be replaced, the paths that had been narrow became non-existent. The war would end with unconditional German surrender. The only remaining question was how many people would die before the men responsible for making that determination were willing to make it. In the end, it would be millions. Millions of soldiers and civilians on all sides, dying in battles and bombing raids and on forced marches and in concentration camps between June 1944 and May 1945, in the gap between the moment the wall fell and the moment the regime that had built it finally accepted that it had fallen. This is the most important thing to hold in mind when you think about what happened on June 6, 1944. It is not simply a story about military history, although it is certainly that. It is a story about the human cost of leadership that cannot update, cannot revise, cannot look at evidence and draw from the conclusions that the evidence supports. It is a story about what happens when the framework of certainty that a leader has built their identity around meets a reality that the framework cannot contain. The Atlantic Wall was real. The Atlantic Wall fell. And the man who had built his entire strategic vision around the certainty that it could not fall spent the remaining 11 months of his life in the wreckage of that certainty, surrounded by generals who were afraid to tell him what they knew and staffs who had learned that their survival depended on presenting him with pictures of the world that he could bear to look at. In that final period, the quality that had made him formidable in the early years, the absolute conviction, the refusal to accept limitations, the willingness to stake everything on a single throw, became something else entirely. It became the mechanism by which a war that was already lost was kept going long enough to kill millions more people. The beach at Omaha is quiet now. If you go there on a morning when the tourists are not yet out and stand at the waterline and look up at the bluffs, it is possible, if you know the history and if you look carefully, to identify the positions from which the German guns covered every approach to the sand. The bunkers are still there, most of them concrete hulks that have been sitting above the French coast for 80 years. The obstacles are gone. The bodies are long since buried. In the military cemetery above the beach, 9,000 Americans lie in rows that stretch across the bright Norman grass as far as the eye can see. The wall they helped destroy is grass and concrete and rust. The Reich that built it is dust. But the beach remembers. And if you stand there long enough, looking out at the channel, it is possible to feel something of what it cost and understand in your own bones what it means when a thing that someone told you was impossible turns out to be not just possible, but already done. The intelligence failure that made everything possible. Before we can fully understand what happened in those critical first hours of June 6th, we need to spend more time with the intelligence picture, because the intelligence failure that shaped German decision-making on D-Day was not an accident, and it did not happen overnight. It was a product of one of the most sophisticated and sustained deception operations in the history of warfare, a campaign so comprehensive in its execution and so successful in its effect that its full scope was not understood even by those who planned it until long after the war had ended. Operation Fortitude was the umbrella name for the Allied deception effort designed to convince the German High Command that the main Allied invasion would strike the Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy. It worked through several interlocking mechanisms, each supporting the others, creating a picture that the German intelligence services found entirely convincing because the picture was built from information they trusted and validated through sources they believed reliable. The centerpiece of Fortitude South, the part of the operation directed at the Pas-de-Calais threat, was a fictional First United States Army group known in Allied planning documents as FUSAG. FUSAG was an army group that existed only in the Allied deception apparatus, in the radio traffic that signals teams generated around the clock from transmitters positioned in southeast England, in the administrative paperwork that was deliberately allowed to be observed by German agents who had been turned by British intelligence and were now feeding their handlers carefully controlled information, in the order of battle documents that were fed to German intelligence through channels that appeared independent of each other, but were actually all controlled by the same Allied Deception Directorate. FUSAG had a staff, a headquarters, subordinate formations, logistical arrangements, and everything else that a genuine army group preparing for a major operation would possess, except soldiers. Everything about FUSAG was constructed, and to command this construction, the Allies made the single most important decision in the entire deception plan. They assigned George Patton. The choice of Patton was a stroke of operational genius. Patton's reputation in the German military had been built over 2 years of watching him operate in North Africa and Sicily, and the German assessment of him was higher, in some respects, than the assessment held by his own superiors, who found him brilliant but exhausting. German intelligence had concluded, from the evidence of his campaigns, that Patton was the most dangerous Allied operational commander in theater, the man most likely to be given the most important assignment, the man whose presence at the head of formation was the best single indicator that that formation's mission was intended to be decisive. When he was placed in nominal command of FUSAG and the signals that confirmed his presence in southeast England began flowing into German listening posts, the German intelligence picture locked in around conclusion that the Allies had designed it to reach. The main Allied effort was going to come from the southeast of England, cross the Channel at its narrowest point, and strike the Pas-de-Calais. What made the deception truly extraordinary was its use of turned German agents. The British Security Service, MI5, had detected and turned virtually every German intelligence agent operating in the United Kingdom during the war, and most of those turned agents had been running ever since as double agents, feeding their German handlers the information that British intelligence wanted Germany to receive. The most important of these was Juan Pujol Garcia, a Spaniard who hated the Nazis and had approached the British when offered to spy for them, been initially rebuffed, and then built his own fictional spy network from scratch and sold it to Germans before the British realized what he was doing and brought him in, under the code name Garbo. Pujol ran a network of 27 fictional subagents who reported to their German controllers with the rich operational detail that serious intelligence sources were supposed to provide. The Germans trusted Garbo. They valued him highly. They awarded him the Iron Cross. And everything Garbo and his fictional network told German intelligence confirmed that the main Allied threat was at the Pas-de-Calais. By June 1944, the German picture of Allied intentions in the West had been constructed so thoroughly around the Pas-de-Calais that reports of activity in Normandy were processed through that framework rather than being evaluated on their own terms. When the 15th Army Signals Intelligence Unit intercepted a coded BBC message on the evening of June 5th that was a prearranged signal to French resistance networks that the invasion was imminent, the Army immediately alerted all commands in France. But the alert focused attention on the Pas-de-Calais sector, where the German commanders were most prepared to receive it. The first report of airborne activity over Normandy were evaluated in the context of an intelligence picture that said, if something is happening in Normandy, it is probably a feint. The real crossing is coming north of the Seine. This framework persisted for weeks after D-Day with a tenacity that astonished even the Allied officers who had designed it. On June 9th, 3 days after the landings, Garbo sent German intelligence a message that was possibly the most important single communication of the entire deception operation. The Normandy landings were a diversionary attack, he reported, intended to draw German reserves south before the main Allied force crossed the Pas-de-Calais. The timing of the message, sent after D-Day, when a genuine agent might have been expected to have realized the truth, was carefully calculated to give the Germans maximum reason to hold their Pas-de-Calais reserves in place. Hitler himself reportedly accepted the report's conclusions and issued orders to delay the movement of armored divisions from the 15th Army area to Normandy. The reserves that might have reinforced the Norman front sat behind the Pas-de-Calais fortifications, waiting for an invasion that would never come. This is a dimension of the Atlantic Wall's fall that is least often discussed, but most important to understand. The physical structure was compromised by human error and material reality, but it was the intelligence framework built around it that prevented the German response from having any chance of effectiveness. The wall was not just breached on the beaches. It was undermined months and years before the first landing craft hit the sand, by a systematic effort to ensure that the man who commanded its defense would wake up on the morning of the invasion believing that what he was seeing was not the real thing, what the German soldiers knew. There's a gap in any war between what the generals in the headquarters know and what the soldiers in the line know. The gap is not always in the direction that popular imagination suggests. Sometimes the generals know more than the soldiers, because they have access to intelligence and strategic context that the men in the foxholes do not. But in the summer of 1944, in the Norman Bocage, the gap ran the other way. The soldiers in the German lines knew something that the generals were not fully communicating to Hitler, and that Hitler was not fully acknowledging when they did communicate it. What the German soldiers knew was this: the men on the other side of the hedgerows were not going to stop. They had the equipment and the numbers and the air support and the naval gunfire and the logistical depth, and they were going to keep coming. And eventually they were going to break through, and when they broke through, there would not be enough German strength left to stop them. This knowledge did not make the German soldiers fight less hard. If anything, the combination of professional pride, unit cohesion, and a particular psychology of men who understood that defeat was coming but refused to be the individual whose actions brought about made them fight with ferocity, and a skill that Allied commanders consistently found unsettling even in victory. But the knowledge was there, in the letters home that the censors sometimes missed, in the conversations between veteran NCOs and younger soldiers that took place in foxholes and command bunkers and supply routes at night, in a particular quality of the courage that men display when they are fighting for something they know is already lost. Some of those soldiers' letters have survived. They describe the Norman summer with a clarity and a specificity that the official reports do not match. A sergeant of the 12th SS, writing to his family in Germany in late June, describes the Bocage fighting in terms that are at once proud of his division performance and entirely realistic about what it means. They fight well, he writes, but there are too many of them. For every one we kill, 3 more appear. The planes never stop. The artillery is endless. We are holding, but we cannot hold forever, and everyone knows it. He asks about conditions at home. He does not ask about the progress of the war. He has stopped asking about the progress of the war, which is itself a kind of answer. The soldiers' knowledge was the knowledge of people in direct contact with reality. They could feel the weight of what was pressing against them. They could hear the supply convoys on the Allied side of the line, the trucks that ran all night, the noise of engines that never seemed to stop, the evidence of a logistical machine that was working at a scale German logistics could not match. They could see the fighter bombers overhead, day after day, and know that those aircraft were making it impossible for German reinforcements to reach them the strength that would be needed to change the situation. And they could count the replacements who arrived and became casualties, count the tanks that were knocked out and not replaced, count the ammunition that was expended and the ammunition that was supposed to be coming forward and was not arriving. The mathematics were not complicated, and the soldiers understood them. It was the generals who could not say the mathematics out loud. It was the headquarters that translated the soldiers' knowledge into reports that preserved the facts and lost the meaning. And it was the supreme commander who could not hear the meaning even when someone found the courage to say it directly. The collapse of Army Group B. The operational collapse of Army Group B in August 1944 was one of the fastest and most complete reversals of a major military formation in the history of mechanized warfare. In the space of approximately 6 weeks, from the beginning of Operation Cobra on July 25th to the closing of the Falaise Pocket in mid-August, 2 German field armies that had been fighting stubbornly and effectively in the Norman Bocage were essentially destroyed as coherent fighting forces. Operation Cobra began with the kind of aerial bombardment that redefined what air-ground coordination could accomplish. General Omar Bradley had requested a carpet bombing of the German positions at the western edge of the Bocage, designed to create a breach in the German line through which American armor could pour into the open country of Brittany and the Loire Valley beyond. The bombing employed 1,200 heavy bombers of the 8th Air Force, followed by fighter bombers and medium bombers in successive waves, all directed at a strip of German-held territory approximately 6,000 yards wide and 2,000 yards deep. The German units holding that strip, primarily elements of Panzer Lehr and infantry divisions, were subjected to a concentration of explosive power that had no precedent in the history of ground warfare. The bombing also killed and wounded American soldiers when bombs fell short, a tragedy that haunted Bradley for the rest of his life, and that produced a bitter controversy about the execution of the plan. But even with its terrible costs and friendly casualties, Cobra worked. When the American ground forces moved through the bomb zone, they found German positions that had been physically annihilated. Men who had survived the bombing were in many cases too concussed to function. Communications networks had been destroyed. Command structures had ceased to exist. Panzer Lehr, which had been one of the most effective German formations in the Bocage fighting, was effectively destroyed as a coherent unit in the bombing alone. Through the gap that Cobra tore in the German line, American armored divisions poured south and west with a speed that had not been seen in the European theater since 1940. General George Patton, the real Patton, not the fictional Patton of the deception operation, was given command of the 3rd Army and unleashed on the breakout with exactly the kind of operational freedom that the Bocage fighting had denied all Allied commanders for 6 weeks. His armored columns raced across Brittany, turned east, and began the sweeping maneuver that would carry the Allied forces across France at a pace that stunned observers on both sides. Hitler's response to the breakout was characteristic and catastrophic. Rather than ordering the German forces in Normandy to retreat to a defensible line, he ordered a counterattack toward Avranches, the hinge of the American breakout, with the objective of cutting off the American armor that had poured through Cobra's breach. The counterattack, Operation Luttich, was launched on August 7th and achieved very limited initial progress before being stopped by American anti-tank weapons and, above all, by Allied tactical air power. The Hawker Typhoons of the RAF 2nd Tactical Air Force descended on the German armor columns moving toward Avranches and destroyed them with rockets and cannon fire in what the German crews who survived it described as the most terrifying experience of the entire war. The attack was halted, the attacking forces were destroyed, and the German position in Normandy was now exposed on its southern flank in a way that made the encirclement at Falaise possible. The Falaise pocket was created by the convergence of American forces moving north from the south, with British and Canadian forces pressing south from Caen. The German command was slow to recognize what was happening. Slow, in part, because the command structure had been so disrupted by the events of the previous weeks, and slow in part because the scale of the Allied maneuver was difficult to process in the context of a defensive posture that had been oriented toward linear resistance rather than the kind of three-dimensional encirclement that Allied mobility was now creating. By the time German commanders at the highest levels understood that their forces were being surrounded, the ring was nearly closed. The evacuation from the pocket was a catastrophe that survivors described in terms that placed it among the most terrible experiences of the war on any front. The roads inside the shrinking pocket were blocked by burning vehicles, dead horses, abandoned equipment, and the bodies of men who had not made it out. Allied artillery fired continuously into the mass of men and machines. Allied aircraft swept over the pocket whenever the weather permitted, adding to the carnage. The men who escaped did so largely on foot, filtering through gaps in the Allied ring before it closed completely, leaving behind everything that could not be carried by a man walking in the dark. When the pocket was finally sealed, the Germans who remained inside were captured or killed. The equipment of two field armies, the tanks, the artillery, the trucks, the communications gear, the organizational infrastructure that a modern army requires to function, was destroyed or captured in the Norman field around Falaise. The army groupie that emerged from the pocket was a broken thing, its organizational structure disrupted beyond rapid repair, its equipment largely gone, its veteran soldiers dead or captured in numbers that could not be replaced from the resources available to Germany in 1944. The liberation of France and the drive to Germany. The liberation of Paris on August 25, 1944, was among the most emotionally charged events of the entire war, and its significance was understood by everyone who witnessed it in exactly those terms. Paris was not primarily a military objective. It was a symbol of France, of European civilization, of everything the Nazi occupation had sought to suppress and control since June 1940. When General de Gaulle walked down the Champs-Élysées through a crowd of Parisians who were laughing and weeping simultaneously, he was enacting a moment that had been longed for and planned for and worked toward for 4 years, and the weight of those 4 years was present in the faces of the people who lined the route. From the Allied perspective, the liberation of Paris marked the beginning of a phase of the campaign that initially seemed to confirm the most optimistic projections of the planners who had drawn up the original invasion timetable. German forces were retreating across France faster than the Allied pursuit could keep pace with. The supply system that had been so carefully developed and prepositioned was being strained to its limit by the speed of the advance, and by September 1944 the advance was beginning to slow not because of German resistance, but because the fuel to keep it going was running out. The famous logistics crisis of the autumn of 1944, in which the Allied armies, racing across France on a shoestring of improvised supply, found themselves halted at the German border not by the Wehrmacht, but by the empty fuel tanks of their own vehicles, was a consequence of success so complete that the planning had not been designed to accommodate it. The pause of the logistics crisis imposed on the Allied advance in September and October gave the German military command time to do something it had not been able to do in the chaos of the Normandy breakout and the subsequent pursuit: stabilize a line. The West Wall, the Siegfried Line, the chain of fortifications that Germany had built along its western frontier in the 1930s, had been stripped of its weapons and its garrison in the desperate attempt to find resources for the Atlantic Wall. But the concrete was still there, and the physical obstacles were still there, and in the autumn of 1940, the Wehrmacht managed to find enough men and weapons to occupy those fortifications and create a defensive line that the Allied armies, starved of supply, could not quickly penetrate. The advance to the Rhine that had seemed imminent in September was delayed for months, and in those months, Hitler planned his last offensive. The endgame, the Ardennes Offensive of December 1944, the Battle of the Bulge, as the Americans called it, was conceived and planned by Hitler over the autumn of 1944 with secrecy so extreme that many of the officers who would lead it did not receive their orders until days before it began. The conception was audacious. Strike through the Ardennes, the same force through which Germany had launched its decisive blow in May 1940, surprised the Allied forces who had assessed the sector as too difficult for a major offensive, drive the Meuse River crossings, and then swing north to capture Antwerp, the primary Allied supply port, and cut off the British and Canadian army groups from their logistics. If it worked, it would create a crisis in the Allied coalition. It might not win the war, but it might, Hitler believed, create the conditions in which a negotiated peace was possible, in which the Western Allies, shocked by a sudden German recovery, might consider terms that preserved something of what Germany had built. The planning was meticulous. The secrecy was extraordinary, stricter than anything that had been attempted in previous German offensive operations. The forces were assembled through a process of deliberate deception, moving by night, maintaining radio silence, concealing the concentration from Allied area reconnaissance. The weather forecast for December in the Ardennes was poor, clouds and fog, the kind of weather that would ground the Allied tactical air forces and give the German armored columns of protection from air attack that had been denied them throughout the Normandy campaign. It was the last condition that Hitler required, and it was the one condition he could not fully control. He trusted the forecast. He needed the weather to hold. The offensive began on December 16, 1944, and in its first days it achieved everything that secrecy and surprise could achieve. The American forces in the Ardennes sector, holding what had been considered a quiet stretch of the line with units that were either resting after hard fighting elsewhere or being broken into frontline conditions, were overwhelmed in several sectors. German armored columns poured through the gaps in the American line and drove west toward the Meuse with a speed and aggression that the Allied command had not anticipated. The bulge in the Allied line that gave the battle its popular name appeared on maps almost overnight, and for a period of several days, the senior Allied commanders, including Eisenhower, were genuinely uncertain about the scale of what they were facing. But the Ardennes offensive contained within it, from its first day, the seeds of its own failure. The fuel supply that the advancing German columns required was insufficient to carry them to their objectives. Some units ran out of fuel within the first days and were stopped not by Allied resistance, but by the absence of the logistical support that the ambition of the plan required. The town of Bastogne, a critical road junction in the southern shoulder of the Bulge, was held by the American 101st Airborne Division, which had arrived there by chance and truck rather than by design, and which refused surrender despite being surrounded and despite the entreaties of German officers who offered surrender terms in language that the acting commander of the 101st, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, famously declined in a single word. Bastogne held. The southern shoulder of the Bulge held. And on the northern shoulder, American units fought with a tenacity that slowed the advance toward the critical Meuse crossings below the speed the plan required. And then the weather cleared. On December 23rd, the fog that had been grounding the Allied air forces lifted, and the Hawker Typhoons and the P-47 Thunderbolts and the P-51 Mustangs rose from their airfields in England and France and descended on the German columns with everything they had. The roads of the Ardennes, packed with German vehicles, became a killing ground reminiscent of the Norman bocage at its worst. Fuel convoys that the advancing German spearheads desperately needed were destroyed from the air before they could deliver their loads. The counteroffensive that Patton launched from the south, pivoting 3 divisions 90 degrees and driving north through the snow toward Bastogne in a feat of operational improvisation that left even his critics speechless, broke through to the 101st on December 26th and began the process of collapsing the southern wall of the Bulge. By January 1945, the Bulge had been eliminated and the front had returned, roughly, to where it had been in early December. Germany had committed to the Ardennes, a fence of the last mobile reserves it possessed in the West. Those reserves were now destroyed. The West Wall was stripped of the forces that had given it its autumn defense. The road to the Rhine was open. The Rhine was crossed at Remagen on March 7, 1945, when American soldiers found a railway bridge still intact and pushed across it before the German demolition charges could be fully detonated. It was not the crossing that the Allied planners had designed. But it was a crossing, and the strategic significance of a bridge across the Rhine in Allied hands was immediately obvious to everyone on both sides. German forces spent days trying to destroy the bridge, bombing it repeatedly, sending frogmen to plant explosive charges against its piers, launching V-2 rockets at it in one of the last operationally significant uses of that weapon. The bridge eventually collapsed under the accumulated damage, but by then the Allied bridgehead east of the Rhine was large enough and secure enough that the bridge no longer mattered. The Rhine had been crossed. The last major geographic barrier between the Allied armies and the German heartland had been breached. From the crossing of the Rhine to the German surrender took less than 2 months. In the west, American and British armored columns advanced across Germany at a pace that would have seemed impossible a year earlier, covering distances in days that the Bocage fighting had covered in weeks. In the east, the Soviet armies that had broken through on the Vistula in January were advancing through Poland and into Germany itself, their momentum sustained by a logistical and operational preparation that dwarfed anything the Germans could bring against it. The geography of the Third Reich, which had once stretched from the Atlantic to the Caucasus, contracted through March and April into the shrinking territory between closing fronts. Hitler remained in Berlin as the Soviet forces encircled the city. In the Führer bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, he held his final command conferences, issuing orders to army groups and divisions that existed largely on paper, demanding counterattacks that could not be assembled from the forces available, maintaining the framework of command authority that had been the instrument of his power for 12 years, even as the territory commanded shrank to a few square miles of rubble. Those who were present in the bunker in the final weeks describe an atmosphere of unreality so complete that it had ceased to be recognizable as any particular psychological state, and it becomes simply the permanent condition of the place, a condition in which orders were issued and acknowledged and not executed, in which maps showed the positions of formations that no longer existed, in which the vocabulary of military command continued to be deployed in a context where command had ceased to have operational meaning. On April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler died by his own hand in the Führer bunker. The Reich he had built and the vision that had built it died with him. On May 8th, 1945, the unconditional surrender of Germany was accepted by the Allied powers. The war in Europe was over. The beaches at Normandy are quiet now. The Bocage fields where so many men died in the summer of 1944 are farmed again, their earthen banks still standing, their hedgerows still growing. The bunkers are still on the cliffs above Omaha, their concrete absorbing the rain and the salt air of 80 Norman winters. The American cemetery on the bluff above the beach holds 9,387 graves, white marble markers in rows that stretch across the grass in the Norman light. The British and Canadian cemeteries scattered through the Norman countryside hold their own thousands. The German War Cemetery at Lockham holds more than 20,000 German soldiers in a landscape that feels different from the Allied cemeteries. Darker, more subdued, the flat stone markers a different kind of testimony to the same summer's killing. Standing at Omaha on a quiet morning, looking out at the Channel water, you can think about what it cost, not just in the immediate human sense, though that cost is present in every grave marker in every cemetery, and it is present in the faces of the people who come to the cemetery and look at the names on the stones and try to understand what they are looking at. But in the larger sense, what it costs to the gap between the Atlantic Wall as it existed and the Atlantic Wall as Hitler believed it to be demonstrated with the force required to demonstrate it. What it costs to the certainty of a man who had built his entire leadership on the infallibility of his own vision to meet the reality of a wall that fell. The answer is on those markers in those cemeteries. The answer is in the rubble of the German cities bombed through the winter and spring of 1944 and 1945. The answer is in the unmarked graves of the millions who died in the camps and the forced marches and the reprisals and all the other instruments of a regime that maintained itself until the end through violence against anyone it defined as its enemy. The cost of certainty, when it becomes a framework of power, is paid not by the certain but by everyone else. The Atlantic Wall fell, and with it fell a vision of the world, and the vision cost what visions always cost when they outlast the reality they were supposed to describe. If this documentary gave you a new way of understanding what D-Day meant, not just as a military operation, but as a moment when the architecture of certainty was tested and found to be the thing it had always been rather than the thing it claimed to be, then I hope you'll share it with someone who would find it just as compelling. And if you want to keep going deeper into the hidden history of the Second World War, the decisions behind the decisions, the rooms where hard truths were spoken or swallowed, the moments when individual psychology shaped the course of entire campaigns, subscribe and turn on notifications. We will be here every week. I will see you in the next one. The Last Commanders, von Kluge, Rommel, and the Weight of Knowing. The human story of the German High Command in the summer of 1944 is, at its core, a story about the weight of knowledge that cannot be acted upon. The officers who commanded German forces in France in the weeks and months after D-Day were, by and large, not stupid men or cowardly ones. Many of them were among the most professionally accomplished soldiers that the German army, which has spent a century developing one of the finest professional military traditions in the world, had ever produced. They could read operational situations. They could assess relative strength. They could do the arithmetic of attrition and supply a material balance that made a conclusion about what was happening in Normandy not just available but inescapable. And many of them reached that conclusion privately in the weeks after the wall fell. The problem was a gap between what they knew and what they were permitted to say, and the personal cost of trying to close it. Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge arrived to replace von Rundstedt as Commander-in-Chief west on July 2, 1944. With a reputation built over years on the Eastern Front and with a determination to make the Normandy situation work, that was, perhaps, his most important initial quality. He had not been in France during the critical weeks around D-Day. He had not watched from inside the system as the decisions were made that led to failure to stop the invasion on the beaches, the failure to release the panzers in time, the failure to mount the decisive counterattack that Rommel had argued for. He arrived fresh, with energy and the particular confidence of man who had not yet been tested by this specific situation. He spent his first days making his own assessment of the front, visiting commanders, reading reports, driving through the Norman countryside to look at what was happening in the bocage with his own eyes. The assessment took approximately 2 weeks. By mid-July, von Kluge was writing to Hitler in terms that, while more carefully phrased than von Rundstedt's blunt advice to make peace, communicated essentially the same judgment. The situation was not reversible. The Allied material preponderance was not something that tactical skill and the courage of German soldiers could compensate for indefinitely. The request for additional forces, the panzer divisions, the infantry replacements, the fuel, the ammunition, the air support that might change the calculus, would not be fulfilled in any time frame that the front could survive. He expressed these judgments with the precision of a man who understood that he was committing words to paper that might later be held against him, and who was choosing to commit them anyway because the alternative, pretending that the situation was something other than what it was, had ceased to be something he could professionally do. Hitler's response was to demand counterattacks. The Operation Ludish disaster, the attempt to drive armored forces to the American southern flank toward Avranches in early August, was a direct product of Hitler's refusal to accept the strategic analysis his field commanders were providing. Von Kluge opposed the operation, argued against it, and then executed it with what competence he could bring to bear when the order came down in a form that left no room for further argument. The operation failed with completeness that left the German position in Normandy untenable, and von Kluge survived it only long enough to preside over the disaster of the Falaise pocket. After Falaise, von Kluge disappeared for a period long enough that Hitler, in Berlin, began to suspect that his field marshal was attempting to negotiate a surrender with the Western Allies. The suspicion was unfounded. Von Kluge had been out of communication because his vehicle had been caught in an Allied air attack and his staff had been unable to reach him for hours. But the suspicion, once formed, was the kind of thing that did not dissolve in the face of innocence. Von Kluge was relieved of command on August 17th. On his way back to Germany, he took poison, leaving behind a letter to Hitler that was among the most extraordinary documents produced by anyone in the German High Command during the entire war. The letter asked Hitler to end the war. It expressed, with the directness of a man who knows he is dying has no reason to withhold, the judgment that von Kluge had been forming throughout his weeks of command in France. The war was lost. The continuation of the fighting served no purpose that could be weighed against its cost, and the responsibility for the situation rested with the decisions that had been made at the highest level. He did not accuse directly. The letter was written with particular care of a man who was aware that his family's safety might depend on the tone of what he left behind. But the meaning was unmistakable, and it was the same meaning that von Rundstedt had expressed in his blunt advice to the OKW representative and that Rommel had expressed in his letter of late June. The Atlantic Wall has fallen, the war in the West is lost, and the only question remaining is how much it will cost to finally acknowledge what is already true. Rommel himself did not live to see the end. His car was strafed by British fighter bombers on July 17th, on a road in Normandy, and he was critically injured in the crash that followed. He was taken from the front to a hospital and then to his home in Württemberg, where he was recovering from his injuries when the July 20th investigation identified him as someone who had been aware of conspiracy and had not reported it. On October 14, 1944, two generals arrived at his home with a choice: face a public trial before the People's Court, which would mean death for him and almost certainly serious consequences for his family, or take poison and be given a state funeral, with his family protected and his reputation maintained. Rommel took poison. His death was announced as a result of his injuries. Germany mourned its most famous general. The truth about what had actually happened would not be fully documented until after the war. These endings: von Kluge on the road back to Germany, Rommel in his home in Württemberg, the conspirators of July 20th executed in the most brutal ways available to a regime that was determined to make their deaths as degrading as possible, are the human cost of the gap between knowledge and permission to speak it. These were professional soldiers who understood what was happening and who, in various ways and at various stages of their recognition, tried to act on that understanding. The system they were part of killed them for it, and the war continued, costing more lives every week, because the man at the center of that system could not process the information that would have required him to acknowledge that his framework was wrong. The technology of defeat. How Allied industry won the war that Atlantic Wall was supposed to prevent. The fall of the Atlantic Wall was not just a result of Allied military skill and German strategic miscalculation. It was a result of something more fundamental: the overwhelming material superiority that the Allied industrial machine had built up over 4 years of war, and that was deployed for the first time at its full scale on June 6, 1944. The numbers, when you look at them, are staggering. The fleet that assembled off the Normandy coast on the night of June 5th comprised more than 5,000 vessels, warships, transport ships, landing craft, supply vessels, hospital ships, escort vessels, representing a combined naval power that had no precedent in the history of warfare. The cargo capacity of that fleet allowed the Allies to put ashore, in the first 24 hours, approximately 156,000 men and their equipment. In the days and weeks that followed, the Allies would construct two artificial harbors, the Mulberry Harbors off the Normandy coast, prefabricated structures towed across the channel in sections and assembled in place, designed to provide the port capacity that the Germans had assumed no invasion could succeed without capturing. The logistical ambition of the entire operation was, in retrospect, almost incomprehensible, not just in its scale but in the confidence it reflected, the confidence of planners who were certain enough of their industrial base and their organizational capacity to commit to an undertaking that had no margin for material failure. The aircraft were equally representative of the industrial balance. The Allied air forces that supported the Normandy landings numbered more than 12,000 aircraft of all types, a figure that dwarfed the entire Luftwaffe at any point in its history. Not all of those aircraft were over Normandy on any given day, but enough of them were, consistently, that the Luftwaffe's ability to contest the skies over the beachhead was essentially zero from the first hours of the operation. German fighter pilots who flew missions over Normandy in June 1944 reported conditions that made the experiences of their comrades on the Eastern Front look manageable by comparison. So many Allied aircraft in the air that individual German fighters were consistently outnumbered by factors that made any tactical skill effectively irrelevant. The Luftwaffe flew fewer sorties over Normandy on the first day of the invasion than the Allied air forces flew in the first hour. This disparity was not the result of a single decision or a single failure. It was the accumulated product of 4 years of industrial and operational decisions. The decision to invest in strategic bombing at the expense of fighter production, the decision to prioritize quantity in aircraft manufacturing at a point when quality might have preserved Luftwaffe effectiveness longer, the decision to disperse aircraft production in response to Allied bombing in ways that reduced efficiency rather than preserving capacity. And it was the accumulated product of the Allied decision to build, from 1940 onward, the industrial machine that could produce these numbers, the American decision, in particular, to convert the largest industrial economy in the world to war production at a scale that German planners, when they first received reports of American production figures in 1942 and 1943, had genuinely refused to believe. The numbers did not make sense within the framework of what they thought an economy could produce. The numbers were nevertheless accurate. This is a dimension of the Atlantic Wall's failure that connects it to the longest arc of the war's history. The wall was built to compensate for a material disadvantage that its builder never fully acknowledged. Hitler had known intellectually, since at least 1942, that American industrial entry into the war would create production imbalances that could not be overcome by German industry at any conceivable rate of expansion. He had chosen, in response to this knowledge, to believe that the imbalances could be compensated for by other factors, by superior German tactics, by superior German technology, by the particular qualities of German soldiers and German leadership that he had spent his career celebrating and promoting. He was wrong. The tactical superiority was real, but insufficient. The technological advantages existed in some areas and were absent in others, and even where they existed, they were too few in quantity and too late in deployment to change the fundamental equation. And the qualities of German soldiers and leadership, while genuinely remarkable in many respects, were not a substitute for the fuel that was not available, the ammunition that was not delivered, the aircraft that were not in the sky above the Normandy beaches when they were needed most. The Atlantic Wall was, in the end, a physical expression of a strategic delusion, the delusion that willpower and concrete could substitute for the material foundations of modern industrial warfare. It failed not just because the concrete was thin in the wrong places, and the men behind it were not always the best the Wehrmacht had to offer. It failed because the entire strategic conception behind it, the idea that the western coastline of Europe could be held against an opponent with the industrial resources that the United States and the British Empire combined could bring to bear, was founded on a misunderstanding of what modern war required. The wall was the symptom. The delusion was the disease. And the disease was not cured on June 6, 1944. It was only demonstrated, at a cost that the cemeteries above those Norman beaches still record for anyone willing to look. The human geography of defeat, a continent transformed. The fall of the Atlantic Wall did not just decide a military campaign. It decided the shape of the post-war world. This is worth dwelling on, because the connection between what happened on those beaches in June 1944 and the world that emerged from the war's end is sometimes obscured by the focus on the military narrative, on the operations and the campaigns and the strategic decisions that fill the histories. The larger picture requires stepping back far enough to see the whole, and when you step back that far, what you see is a single morning in Normandy that set in motion a chain of consequences that reshaped an entire civilization. The most immediate consequence was the liberation of Western Europe. The Norman beaches were the doorway through which the Allied armies entered the continent and began the process of rolling back the occupation that had covered France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Denmark, Norway, and other nations for 4 years. This process was not bloodless or simple. The fighting from Normandy to Berlin cost hundreds of thousands of lives on all sides and destroyed cities and countryside on a scale that the populations who lived through it found almost impossible to absorb. But the direction of the process was set on June 6, and the direction did not change. The men and women in the occupied countries who had been living under German administration since 1940 began, in the weeks after D-Day, to understand that what they had been told might be impossible was in fact happening. The wall that separated them from the world they had known before the occupation was cracking. The political consequences of the liberation were equally profound. The France that emerged from the German occupation and the liberation was a different country from the France that had been defeated in 1940. Politically fragmented, economically damaged, psychologically marked by the experience of occupation and the questions about collaboration and resistance that the occupation had raised, and that would take decades to fully confront. General de Gaulle's authority, established at the moment of liberation and reinforced by the symbolism of his walk down the Champs-Élysées, gave France a political continuity that the circumstances of the occupation had made uncertain. But the deeper questions about what France had been during those 4 years, about who had collaborated and who had resisted, and what the difference between the two had really meant in daily practice, were questions that the liberation raised without answering, questions that French society would continue to work through for the remainder of the century. The German experience of the war's final phase. The air raids on German cities had intensified to the winter of 1944 and 1945. The approach of Allied and Soviet armies from west and east, the collapse of the institutions that had organized daily life for 12 years, was a trauma that the post-war German nation spent decades processing. The Germany that emerged from May 1945 was a country in ruins, its cities bombed to rubble, its territory divided among the occupying powers, its political institutions dissolved. The work of reconstruction, material, political, and moral, was among the most remarkable achievements of the post-war European order, and it was work that was possible only because the Atlantic Wall had fallen and the regime that had built it had been destroyed. The broader architecture of the post-war world, the United Nations, NATO, the Marshall Plan, the European integration that eventually produced the European Union, was built on the foundation that the Normandy landings created. Without the successful establishment of the Allied beachhead in France, without the liberation of Western Europe that followed from it, the post-war order would look fundamentally different. The extent to which D-Day and the chain of events it set in motion shaped the world that those who were born after 1945 grew up in and took for granted. The democracies, the alliances, the integrated economies, the long peace among the major Western powers, is not always visible precisely because the alternative was prevented. History is not good at making visible the worlds it did not allow to happen, but they were real possibilities, and they were closed off by what happened on those beaches. This is the largest context for the fall of the Atlantic Wall, and it is a context that gives the story of Hitler's reaction to the landings, the misplaced satisfaction, the deferred panzer orders, the slowly cracking framework of certainty, its full weight. The decisions made in those hours by those men in those rooms were not just military decisions. They were decisions about what the rest of the 20th century would look like, and the particular quality of the decision-making, its combination of self-deception and institutional dysfunction, and particular psychology of a leader who had built his authority on the claim of infallibility, ensured that the decisions were as bad as they could possibly have been, given what was available to work with. The wall fell, the world changed, and we are still living in the world that its falling made possible. The soldier's experience, what it felt like from inside the wall. There is a dimension of the Atlantic Wall's fall that does not appear in the operational reports or the strategic assessments or the conference transcripts, a dimension that is visible only in the accounts of the men who were inside the wall when it fell. The German soldiers who were holding the Normandy beaches on June 6, 1944 were not abstractions. They were human beings with families and histories and fears and hopes, doing what soldiers do when a situation develops beyond the parameters of any plan. Their experience of the wall's fall is part of the story, and it is a part that does not always receive the attention it deserves. The accounts of German survivors of the D-Day fighting describe, with remarkable consistency, the shock of scale. Many of the men on the Normandy beaches had been briefed, in the weeks before June, on what an Allied invasion might look like. They had been told about the obstacles on the beach and how the obstacles would destroy the landing craft. They had been told about the artillery that could range on the approach zones. They had been told about the alert system and the response times and the reinforcement plans. What they had not been adequately told, because no briefing could convey it, was what would actually look like when 5,000 ships appeared on the horizon and the sky filled with aircraft and the naval bombardment began. The bombardment was unlike anything that any of the German defenders, including the veterans of the Eastern Front who had survived some of the heaviest artillery engagements of the war, had experienced before. The sheer weight of metal delivered against a relatively small stretch of coastline in the hours before the landings altered the physical landscape. It cratered the beach, buried some of the obstacles, destroyed communications, stunned the men in the bunkers and the trenches to varying degrees depending on the quality of their shelter. Some positions were not seriously damaged, and the men in those positions emerged from the bombardment ready to fight. Others were hit with a directness that left nothing standing and nobody alive. The range of experience within a single beach sector on that single morning was wide enough that survivors from adjacent positions sometimes described what seemed like entirely different battles. What united most of the accounts was the recognition, arriving at different moments for different men, that this was not a drill and not a small raid. and not a diversion. It was what appeared to be a full-scale invasion of the kind that the German command had told them would never reach this coast, would be stopped by the wall, would be destroyed in the surf. The wall was not stopping it. The surf was full of Allied soldiers, and the soldiers were reaching the sand, and the sand was being crossed in the face of everything that the German positions could bring to bear. For many of the German defenders, this recognition, arriving while they were firing, while the battle was still in its most intense phase, while the outcome was still uncertain, was itself one of the most disorienting experiences of their lives. The thing that was supposed to be impossible was happening. The defenders who survived the first day and continued fighting in the bocage carried this knowledge with them. The bocage fighting that followed D-Day was, for many German veterans, the most psychologically complex combat they experienced in the entire war. They were fighting with enormous tactical skill and considerable courage in terrain that gave them genuine advantages, slowing the advance that the Allied planners had expected to be faster, imposing costs on the attacking forces that were real and significant. And they were doing this while understanding, at some level that they could not fully express in the conversations around them, that the outcome of the fighting was not in doubt. What was in doubt was only how much it would cost and how long it would take. The men who held this understanding and continued to fight were not doing something simple or easily categorized. They were not fighting because they believed in the cause in the way that the regime's propaganda had asked them to believe. They were fighting for the men next to them, for the unit they had been part of for months or years, for the particular human bonds that form under conditions of shared danger and shared hardship. They were fighting because stopping fighting meant leaving those men alone in the worst possible circumstances, and that was not something that the military culture they had been trained and allowed them to do easily, regardless of what they thought about the strategic situation. They were fighting because fighting was what they were there to do, and because the alternative, the surrender or the rout, or the simply stopping and walking away, required a different kind of decision than anything they had been trained or prepared to make. This is not an excuse and not a justification. It is an attempt to see clearly what the fall of the Atlantic Wall looked like from inside the wall itself. From the perspective of the men who had been told the wall would hold, who discovered on the morning of June 6th that it would not, and who continued to fight in its wreckage for weeks and months after it had already fallen, at a cost that the cemeteries above those Norman beaches and scattered through the Norman countryside still record. The wall fell. The men who had built their lives and their service around the promise that it would hold were left to navigate the gap between the promise and the reality. Some of them found ways through that gap that preserved their dignity and their humanity. Some were destroyed by it. The history of those individual navigations is mostly unrecorded, mostly private, mostly conducted in the small spaces that war leaves for private life. But it was happening everywhere, at every level of the German military structure, in the weeks and months after June 6, 1944. The Atlantic Wall had fallen, and the question of what you do with that knowledge, how you carry it, how you act in its presence, what it costs you to know it, was a question that every German soldier and every German officer faced in the summer of 1944. Not all of them found an adequate answer. But then, the question was one that nobody should have had to answer. The wall should not have been built on a lie. The strategy should not have been built on a framework of certainty that could not accommodate revision. The men should not have been placed in those positions and told that the wall would hold. These failures of leadership and judgment and honesty are the original cause of everything that followed, and they belong to the man who woke up at the Berghof on the morning of June 6th to find that the thing he had told the world was impossible had already happened. The wall fell, and with it fell everything that it had been built to protect. Understanding the wall's fall requires, in the end, returning to the simplest question: what is a wall for? A wall is for keeping things out. It is a physical declaration that certain things will not be permitted to cross a certain boundary. And the Atlantic Wall, in its conception if not in its execution, was the largest such declaration in modern history. A declaration that Europe, as organized by the Nazi regime, was closed to the outside world, that the order that imposed was permanent, and that the men who had imposed it were prepared to defend that permanence against any challenge. The wall was ideology made concrete. It was a certainty of a vision given physical form along 4,000 miles of coastline. When the wall fell on June 6, 1944, the ideology embodied did not immediately fall with it. The regime continued. The fighting continued. The dying continued. But something fundamental had been demonstrated in the most unambiguous terms available, in the presence of 9,000 ships and 12,000 aircraft and 150,000 men on 5 beaches in a single morning, that the certainty was not justified. The wall that was supposed to be impregnable was not. The order that was supposed to be permanent was not. The vision that had organized a continent suffering for 4 years was built on a foundation that the world, given sufficient time and sufficient determination and sufficient material power, could crack open. This is the enduring meaning of what happened on June 6, 1944. Not just a military victory, though the military victory was real and necessary and cost real lives, but the demonstration, the proof, the answer to the question that the wall had posed about whether certain things were actually possible, delivered in the most unmistakable way that human beings have found to answer such questions.